Her name was Dorothy. In 1948, before she was anyone's wife or anyone's mother, she worked the night shift at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, Ohio. She was 19 years old. She made $11 a week. She held the hands of patients who did not survive the night. She was never once allowed to cry in front of them. By the time Dorothy left nursing in 1950 to get married, she had learned things no one ever wrote down for her, things she never called training, things she simply carried. 40 years later, at her own husband's hospital bedside, her daughter watched something strange happen. The doctor delivered the worst possible news in the room. Every other family member broke down. Dorothy did not. She asked 3 calm questions. She held her husband's hand. She did not let her voice shake once. Her daughter asked her afterward how she did that. Dorothy said, "I learned that a long time ago, before any of you." She never explained further. She did not have a therapist who taught her composure, no breathing app counting her inhales, no journal prompting her to process her feelings, no support group meeting on Tuesdays. She had 18 months on a hospital ward when she was 19 years old, and that was enough for the rest of her life. What Dorothy carried out of that hospital were 10 habits so deeply trained into her that she never once called them habits. She called them just how you act. Nobody on her ward called them anything either, because every nurse who trained in 1948 carried the same 10 things home with them. 10 habits. None of them require a license. None of them come with a subscription. This video is about what those habits were, and why an entire generation of women had them, and the next generations didn't. Then something changed. Not the human nervous system. Not what a crisis actually requires from a person standing in the middle of it. What changed is exactly what this video is about. Before number 10, subscribe. This channel exists to tell you exactly this kind of story, every week. Number 10. Dorothy learned to move slowly when everything inside her wanted to move fast. On her first week on the ward, a patient's condition turned suddenly. Dorothy's hands started shaking. A senior nurse grabbed her wrist hard and said one sentence, "Your patient can see your hands." Dorothy never forgot it. From that day forward, whatever was happening inside her, her hands stayed steady on the outside. Research published by the American Psychological Association confirms that visible physical calm in a caregiver directly lowers the stress response of the person they are caring for, a phenomenon now called affective co-regulation. Dorothy's senior nurse did not know that term in 1948. She just knew patients did better with steady hands near them. The corporate wellness industry now spends over $60 billion annually teaching employees techniques for projecting calm under pressure. Dorothy learned it for free, from one sentence, in 1 week. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 9. Dorothy learned to say only what was necessary. On the ward, idle talk near a frightened patient was considered a failure of professionalism. Nurses were trained to speak in short, clear sentences. What was happening? What would happen next? Nothing more. No filling silence with nervous chatter. No narrating her own anxiety out loud. Dorothy carried that silence home. When her son broke his arm at 11, she did not flood him with words. She said what was happening, calmly, and nothing else. Communication researchers at the University of Michigan have found that excess verbal reassurance during a crisis actually increases listener anxiety, while brief, clear statements reduce it. Dorothy's hospital trained her in this in 6 weeks. It now takes a corporate communication seminar charging $400 a day to teach the same thing. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. We are not far from number 1, the habit Dorothy's hospital trained into her so completely that even she forgot where it came from. Stay with me. Number 8. Dorothy learned to eat and sleep on a schedule no matter what the night had held. A nurse coming off a night shift where a patient had died still had to eat breakfast, sleep her allotted hours, and return for the next shift functioning. There was no formal debriefing, no mental health day. The body had to be maintained on schedule regardless of what it had just witnessed. Dorothy carried this rigidly for the rest of her life. Difficult days did not get to disrupt her meals or her bedtime. She had learned at 19 that the body needs its maintenance precisely when the mind is least willing to give it. A 2021 study in Sleep Health Journal found that maintaining consistent sleep and meal timing during emotionally difficult periods significantly reduces the duration and severity of stress-related symptoms. The sleep and recovery coaching industry built around this principle is now worth over $4 billion. Dorothy learned it on a hospital cot in 1949. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 7. Dorothy learned to never ask, "Why is this happening to me?" The hospital had a saying among the nurses: "The ward doesn't care about your feelings, it cares about your hands." Dorothy was taught to set aside the question of fairness entirely and focus only on the next correct action. She carried this through the death of her husband, the illness of her son, every hardship that came after. She was never heard asking why. She was always heard asking what next. Psychologists call this an external locus of action, focusing energy on controllable next steps rather than the uncontrollable question of cause. Research from Stanford's Department of Psychology has linked this orientation to significantly lower rates of prolonged grief disorder and chronic anxiety. Dorothy's hospital trained this into her before she turned 20. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 6. Dorothy learned to touch people who were suffering without flinching. A hand on a feverish forehead. A hand holding a dying patient's hand. No hesitation, no visible discomfort, regardless of what she felt inside. This carried directly into her own family. When her mother was dying decades later, Dorothy sat beside the bed for 6 straight hours, her hand never leaving her mother's, her face calm the entire time. Her daughter, watching from the doorway, has never forgotten it. Touch researchers at Duke University have confirmed that calm physical contact during suffering measurably lowers cortisol in both the person touched and the person touching. Dorothy's hospital required this of every nurse on the ward. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. We are almost at number 1, the single habit that the entire self-help industry has spent the most money trying to repackage and sell back to you. Almost there. Number 5. Dorothy learned to compartmentalize without calling it that. A nurse who carried one patient's death into the next patient's room was considered a danger to that next patient. The hospital trained nurses to fully close one situation before opening the next. Dorothy could not afford to bring her grief from one room into the next. So she learned with brutal precision to set a feeling down completely and return to it later, or never. This skill carried her through more loss than most people experience in a lifetime. Clinical psychologists now teach a formalized version of this called compartmentalization training in trauma-informed therapy programs costing upward of $200 per session. Dorothy was trained for it in a hospital corridor in under a year. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 4. Dorothy learned that her presence mattered more than her words. Patients who were frightened did not need Dorothy to solve anything. They needed her to simply be there, steady, in the room. She carried this into every crisis her family ever faced. She rarely had advice. She was simply present, and her presence alone did the work that advice could not. Research on what psychologists call containment, the simple, steady presence of another calm person during distress, shows it lowers measurable physiological arousal even when no words are exchanged. The entire executive coaching industry, valued at over $15 billion, sells a version of this skill under the name executive presence. Dorothy learned it for $11 a week. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 3. Dorothy learned to never let her face show what her mind was thinking. Patients read their nurses' faces constantly, searching for signs of how serious things were. A flinch, a frown, a flicker of fear. These things spread panic through an entire ward. Dorothy trained her face into stillness. not coldness, stillness. Her grandchildren would later describe her as having the calmest face in any room, never once knowing where that face had been built. Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 2. Dorothy learned to finish every task completely before resting. A half-finished task on a hospital ward could cost a life. Dorothy was trained to complete what was in front of her, fully, before allowing herself to sit down. This carried into every corner of her life. Half done was simply not a category she allowed herself to live in. Her daughter once asked how she managed to never feel behind. Dorothy said, "I finish the thing I'm doing, then I start the next one." Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Number 1. Dorothy learned that her job was to be steady, not to feel nothing. This is the one the self-help industry has never managed to bottle, because it isn't a technique, it's a decision, made once, repeated for 60 years. Dorothy felt everything. The deaths on that ward, her husband's diagnosis, every hard year that came after. She simply decided, at 19 in a hospital hallway, that her feelings would never be the thing other people had to manage. She would feel them fully, privately, later. In front of others, she would be steady. This single decision, repeated thousands of times across 60 years, became the woman her family remembers, the one who never panicked, never collapsed, never once asked anyone to hold her up. She never had a therapist tell her this was healthy. She never had a book explain why it worked. She had a hospital ward, at 19, and a senior nurse who told her once, "Your patient can see your hands." Dorothy never had the product. Dorothy never had the problem either. Dorothy passed away in 2002. She was 74 years old. At her funeral, 3 different people stood up to say the same thing in different words. She was the calmest person I ever knew in a crisis. Her daughter, sitting in the front pew, finally understood where that calm had come from. A hospital ward in 1948, $11 a week. A senior nurse's one sentence. 10 habits Dorothy never named, never wrote down, and never once thought to call training. She simply called it how you act. What changed between Dorothy's hospital ward and your life today was not what a human being needs in order to face hardship steadily. Those needs have not changed since 1948. What changed was who got paid when those needs were repackaged, given new names, and sold back to you one session at a time. Pick one thing from this list. Come back in the comments in a week and tell me what it did. If this is the kind of story you needed today, tell me below. I read every single comment. The next video is already waiting.